Hello, everyone. We are thrilled that you're all here. This is our first webinar this semester. I know, for one, I've missed seeing all of you when we were getting together every week. So welcome back. For those of you who are new, we are really excited you're here, and you'll learn a little bit about our center and all of the governance work we're doing. And I think I can speak for Will too in this, that we just love that this many people want to get together and talk about governance. This is something we think is important enough to study, and we've devoted years of studying it, Will, a lot more than I have. And it's really great when people think that what you study is important. So we hope we can share some really practical things for you. And we're going to let you have some chances to share your ideas and what's going on with your organization and boards right now. So, mouse is moving a little quickly. So for those of you that haven't joined us before, I just wanted to share our mission. The center, we care about creating a vibrant nonprofit and philanthropic sector in Texas. It's that simple. In Texas and beyond, as far as people want to, find us from wherever they are. But we focus on research, outreach, and engaged learning. So that actually spans from continuing ed. We've just entered that arena, and we're offering a certificate in nonprofit leadership as our first thing that we're doing. But we have graduate certificates, master's degrees. So those of you that are really at those inflection points sort of in your career and thinking about what's next, just give us a call and see if we can help. But know that everything that we do is based around the idea that working the nonprofit sector is a noble calling. And it's great to be at the Bush School because President Bush has given us so many good quotes about service that we don't have to reach far to talk about that. It's really a part of who we are and our fabric, not just at the Bush School, but across A&M. So we are thrilled about it. You can see our values, and we're just happy to be able to offer this program today because we know a lot of people are concerned about what's next with their boards. So today we're going to start by sort of acknowledging the challenges of board governance. We're going to ask for participation to talk about some of the topics we're considering right now. And then we're going to move into a little bit more of a tactical piece of it, where we're going to talk about why we should have strategic boards, but talk about board roles, the strategy, and then Dr. Brown's going to wrap up with giving us some really technical tools that you guys can use. So just to let you know, we are, like I said at the very beginning, we are dedicated to excellent governance. We think that that's one of the key elements of strategically managing nonprofits. So my co-presenter here today, Dr. Brown's the director of our center, and he's been studying governance for what, 20 years plus, more than you want to say?
I think we're coming up on 30, believe it or not.
Wow. I knew it was a while because I always like to bring this up. It makes me feel younger, but because I read one of his first articles.
Figured out by now.
Yeah, when I read one of his first articles when I started my dissertation work, but that's been almost 15 years ago now. So the two of us really do care a lot about governance and leadership, and we also have Dr. Kenny Taylor, and he's going to jump on with us at some point today. Just if you have any questions later at the end. But he studies governance and leadership as well. And the unique element of what sort of our combined interests is, we've all studied diversity in board governance. And we've been doing it for, again, 15 or so years, not just a recent thing. And so that's an area that our center does care a lot about. But if you thought it was missing on the agenda, I just wanted to point that out to you. We did a webinar specifically on nonprofit board diversity this fall. And you could actually go onto our resource page at the center and download that. But it's not something we're overlooking. It's something that we think is important enough. We've pulled it out and we approach it separately. Okay. So let's dig into this and get into some good information for you. So one thing that we know, whether you're an executive director or a board chair, or just a board member, there are challenges with the nonprofit structure. And I think it's helpful for us to recognize those up front. I mean, we have limited time to work with our boards. We've got this weird situation, right, of the board supervising the executive director, but at the same time, executive director is really responsible for recruiting and training board members to help them be as successful as they can, and often in a sector that they've never worked in before. So there's that challenge of when do we push and pull, and when do we lead And when we sit back and let the board lead. Then we also have other board members that say, shouldn't the staff be doing everything? So we're looking at a challenging sort of structure to begin with. But we also have, strategic decisions that are having to be made by a large group of people. Some boards are very reasonably sized at 7. Some are, 75, or they're so large that they've got over 100 on the board and their executive committee is 25, which is even a little bigger board than we would like to manage generally. So we have that issue. There's the challenge of being able, if you're particularly on the staff side of it, speaking to those of you in the call today on that, how do you manage these board members? They're volunteers, and how much time can we get from them? How much, influence can we have over it? And how do we make sure that all of our board members can actually come to the table and be oriented well enough and understand our sector well enough to apply their skill sets to really help us make a difference? So that's a challenge. And then that's just in normal times. But now, kind of what we're focusing on today is we are coming out of this extended period of time in crisis. So I said are coming out of. We're hopeful, we're positive, we're going to get there soon. But I can't think of a time that I've been doing this around 20 years where we've had such a period of time where our executives are exhausted because they have decision fatigue. Compassion fatigue, we tend to have, and we have that more frequently when natural disasters happen and things, but those are short term. What this has created for us from a governance structure, what COVID has given us, is a really unique situation of having to adjust our operations and figure out how to keep our organization going, for a year to 18 months. And then once we're able to switch back, then what do we do? So that's why we decided to make that the topic of today, is sort of what do you think about to even prepare for post-COVID? Because we know the boards that start thinking about it now, their organizations are going to be in a better position come September, October, when hopefully a lot of us have been vaccinated and we return to at least a situation where we're in place more often. So some of the things that we think that boards should be considering are these 4 areas. Let me make sure that didn't skip ahead, went too far. Sorry guys, my mouse is really not cooperating right now on my keyboard.
Do you want me to take it back? Or
No, I got it. Thanks. So, when we're trying to think about what our organization should be, how they should be adjusting to operate in September and October, we're looking at 4 primary areas. We're thinking about revenue and fundraising. And the one thing I do want to point out, these are board level conversations. Notice I titled the slide that. We don't want boards to get in a situation of micromanaging, right? Because we're in a situation when we're going to change and maybe have to revert back, change some of our program delivery. We don't want to have the board interfering with the staff operations. We don't want to mix those roles. So what we're talking about today are really the high level strategic decisions that boards should be having. So we think that it's worth thinking about our revenue and our fundraising. It's still going to be a while until that's back to potentially, normal and what we can sort of predict will happen with fundraising. But we do think that boards have to be willing to take some risks in that area, more so than maybe we traditionally would have. We think with our program delivery, we're going to have to consider some things we haven't thought about before. So I know there are a few of you on this call that your demand increased tremendously during COVID. But with that came a big change in the demographic of the constituents you're serving. So, for example, if you think about, if you're the people that you serve increased by 40% during COVID. If you're a frontline provider, you're providing food, you're providing healthcare, things like that. How many of those 40% of clients are you going to retain after this? How many of them were there just as a one-time? They never thought they would need assistance from an organization like yours, but COVID put them in that situation. So I think we have to be really thoughtful, and you have to listen to your staff's as far, and ask them if they're not providing you the information about the demand increase and the change in your demographics, because that's going to influence the strategic options you have moving forward. With technology, we're going to have to think about, now we're all used to meeting via Zoom. We've adjusted a lot of our services online. So which of those things are going to make sense moving forward? And do you have the infrastructure to maintain it long term? Or which of the things does it make sense to strategically cut? So those are areas. And then one of the biggest areas that I've been thinking about lately is human resources. And how is that going to change? So how does that affect the board? Because that may sound like more of a staff or operational issue. But from a board perspective, what I challenge you to think about, it's always hard to find good people, especially fundraisers. But it's challenging to get really good, talented people to join us in our work in the nonprofit sector, because they don't understand it. They think nonprofit means we don't make profits. All those things that we talk about in other classes and sessions. But one thing we always had to offer, besides our mission, was that there was flexibility. And we could usually offer that, and that made it really appealing for people. But if our work changes moving forward, and a lot of people have, a lot of companies have realized working from home is not a bad thing. We cannot pay downtown office rent. And so they're going to be able to offer work from home. So that's one of the things. Also, we have to think about just generally, have you been keeping an eye on your staff? I had a call with about 20 nonprofits the other day, and we talked about sort of self-care, the issues that most nonprofit professionals aren't great at dealing with because we're always so focused on serving other people, and they were exhausted. So as a staff, or as a board, have you checked in on your staff and your ED? So those are some of the things that we've been thinking about. And I was wondering if, now if we could hear from you, what are some of the elements that you've either seen work well, or you've adopted during COVID that make sense, they're effective, and you think you might want to keep as you move forward in any of those elements that we just talked about: HR, technology, programming. And we're not going to put you in breakout rooms because there are so many of us in the room today. It would take forever. We'd rather just, share and learn from each other.
This is Bonnie Farmer from St. Vincent's. I think Paula hasn't had a chance to get on yet. She had another meeting. I would say, just from my perspective and what I've observed, one thing that I would like us to be able to keep is the ability to change direction as quickly as we've had to do so many times during this. We've added some staff, we've added programs, we've added lots of different things. But in a context of keeping what's working, but changing what has worked before to what's working now. And I just would like to be able to keep that flexibility.
No, that's a great one. We kind of pride ourselves in the nonprofit sector about being flexible, but we've actually had to prove it in the last year. So I saw someone in the chat say that remote work is going to stay with their organization, probably some kind of a hybrid. What else do we have?
Hey, Angela, this is Leah with Fort Bend Seniors. Good to see
Leah.
you.
Good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Of course, of course. I would just say it's not really something we intentionally implemented, but I have seen a change in our culture, our workplace culture on the positive side. Both an atmosphere of the team being together, but specifically, I would say prior to the pandemic, there was kind of an unwritten understanding that many of our different leaders had to be involved in almost every aspect of operations and programs. And now it's more trusting people to take care of what's in their lane and what they're overseeing, because it would just be impossible to try to pull everyone together. I don't know if that makes sense, but less everyone involved in programs and projects, but just more trusting and getting updates on projects and how operations are going rather than everyone being involved at the same time.
Oh, that's a great one. Thanks for mentioning it. So a little less micromanagement and, you know, allowing your employees to have more ownership of the programs you've actually hired them to run.
Exactly.
Great. Well, we are going to talk a little bit about that in the culture in just a couple seconds. Does anybody else have something that you want to share? Okay, you're going to keep using telehealth for mental health. Okay, you're not the only one.
Yeah.
Christy's mentioning that. I've heard of that last week. I was up in East Texas, and there's an organization there that said, we've never done telehealth before, but it's really working for us.
I think St. Vincent's will continue to use it as long as we need to. We're back to face now. But as the surges come and go, and you know, with respect to caring for our staff and clinic personnel, we'll go back and forth as we need to, I'm sure. There is some remote working from home from our staff at this point, but most everybody's back in the shop for most of the time.
Okay. See, and that's something else we have to think about. Who has to be there and when, and you know, what sort of flexibility, because a lot of people have been typing in about the flexibility I've seen. Another one I saw was interesting, a finance element that with their spending, they're really only spending what's necessary now. So being very, you know, disciplined with stewardship of the money that we get, that's definitely a good thing that we can take forward with us.
Hey, Angela, it's Doug Tuggett with the Periwinkle Foundation in Houston. How are you?
Oh, good. Hey, Doug.
So we partner with Texas Children's Hospital and provide really a year-round series of camps, arts, and survivor programs. And essentially everything was taken virtual last March. And so the remote camps virtually continued on. A lot of learning lessons there, a lot of benefit to kids that are in the hospital that can't go to camp. So the transition that we've made is really gonna, I think, reshape some of the work that we do once we get back in person. There's a lot of virtual things that we've learned that we can do with these families and children that are especially isolated right now.
Very good. So that's going to affect maybe your programming and how you move forward.
Correct.
One other person, and I think we'll move on so we have time to hear all the other good info with our techniques. But one person mentioned that Zoom is serving them really well, not just in their program delivery, but it's improved their board attendance. So I like that. One of the things we do struggle with sometimes is making sure that we have strong attendance on our board. And I'm on a board right now too that people have said, well, do we want to go back? We're thinking about our calendar for next year. It's like, do we want to go back in person? Because this is working for us. So we are going to keep our board meetings on Zoom, at least during the fall of next year. Well, thank you for your ideas there. And so we can, hopefully you will all stay in touch with each other. It's one of the things we like from these webinars is for people to get to know each other and kind of build the community. So reach out to each other if there's an interesting topic you want to, you know, adopt at your organization that somebody else is doing. So I just listed a couple of the details around these primary topics. Some of you have mentioned it within HR. We want to make sure and think about innovation and staff wellness in their training, all these remote work location. How's that going to change the culture? And having some really honest conversations with the team and let the team build that culture, we think is going to be a positive thing to happen. Rather than having the executive director come in and say, okay, well, everybody has Fridays off. You know, let's discuss that because Fridays may not work for other people. You may be able to provide, you know, sort of retain some of the benefits from remote work, but it might not be a one size fits all. So the board piece of that I'm really concerned about is making sure that after you make these changes, and it's not just, oh, we're in COVID trying to make things work day to day, have you reviewed your policies? And that's something that the board can ask is let's review our policies and make sure that we have policies and procedures that actually match what's happening at the organization right now. That's something to reduce risk for your organization. So nobody mentioned fundraising. which, that breaks my heart a little, but that's okay. Um, you as a board, you want to think about evaluating your revenue streams. So, we have to be, really thoughtful about diversifying that. That taught us all a lesson. And those of you that have known me for a while know that I always say, don't do the event. You don't need those. But and they have a certain place for us. Oh my goodness, something just happened with the whole screen and I didn't touch my keyboard. So let's see if we can get back
That was me.
with that. That's okay. Could you help us get back while I finish? So we have to decide when events really make sense for us. And when they, we always want to incorporate those because events, of course, are helpful, but they can also be extraordinarily expensive ways to raise money and inefficient ways. So we have to be really honest about what role that's going to have moving forward, because if we do it well, it can help, really propel our fundraising efforts. Also, we have to be, when I mentioned taking risks, thinking about, taking a risk and doing something different to expand your donor base, but also focusing on stewardship more than we ever have. And we have talked about that really for almost a year. Anytime we've talked about fundraising, so we won't focus too much on it. But we're also going to have to think about the new way your development officers might work. Those of you that have a staff in development, they're also going to be used to working remotely. What we've learned is donors really like taking a 15 to 20-minute Zoom call, but they don't want you to try and drive to their office or house anymore. So there's going to be a whole new way of executing the work and development that we have to think about, and you have to be ready to support on your board. With technologies, it's just really thinking about all the functional areas and making sure that you have a development plan for technology. Okay, you have your technology plan for the next 3 years. Sometimes that's an overlooked piece in our planning, so it's just something the board should think about. And then with the programming, you want to make sure and identify, what I mentioned earlier with any demographics or demand change, but analyze which of your programs are self-sustaining, which ones make sense to keep, maybe new things that you've added. Should that have just happened during the pandemic, or is that something that's core to your mission and you want to keep moving forward? So really quickly, we've got about 5 minutes. How might your human resources needs and policies change, can you think of? And also the secondary question to this is, how do you think your organization will be able to be more flexible and focus on well-being? Do we have any details that folks are willing to share of what's working for them?
Well, again, I'm speaking to Paula because she's not on yet, but what we've done is review what everybody's doing and see if they can be doing more, or do they need to refocus to another area? Does it make sense to combine some things that people are doing? Because we have that unusual situation with St. Vincent's House on one side and the UTMB clinics on the other side. We walk I'm going to say a tightrope, but not a bad tightrope. It's just an existing rope to make sure that we're doing what we're supposed to do, allowing them to do what their tasks are, but understanding that we really are symbiotic in our approach and what we're trying to do to meet the whole person needs of our clients. And so we've made a lot of adjustments in that regard. One instance is the inception of an interprofessional clinic, where it's like a one-stop shopping. When a person comes for case management, the case manager says, well, so how's your health? Do you need dental? What about nutrition? Do y'all have food? And so we can refer back and forth to the different services that are available within the complex of St. Vincent's, even if it's not just from St. Vincent's, but it's also involving the clinics.
Sure. Okay. So we're thinking you might be able to use the human capital that you have a little differently and partner with people, with other organizations.
Yeah, and this is Paula, and I would also say one thing we found during the pandemic, especially being a small organization, is our human resources wear a lot more hats. We have to become more specialized in many more areas. And that's probably the biggest change that we've seen in the last year.
Great. Anybody else before we head on? I do think that we are going to learn a lot about this over the next 6 months as nonprofits, and as more people become vaccinated and we start, going back in place. So if you're not thinking about it yet, these are some questions that might be helpful. And now I'm going to actually turn it over to my partner here, Will, our center's director.
Thanks, Angela. Appreciate that setup and touching on all of those great topics for conversation. I'll take a little bit here and give you some of my thoughts about the board's role in strategy. Also give you some tactics and recognizing sort of the balance that Angela touched on this. Strategy in particular, when you think about the board's role in strategy, it really is this partnership between the staff, right? Because they know the day-to-day operations, they know the activities of the organization, they know oftentimes the details more than the board, but the board sometimes has a perspective or a vision which is slightly different. And so there's a couple of slides here that we use just to kind of remind people about this conflicting challenge of who's in charge and how this is done. And it takes time for boards to develop up this balance with the executive. At times, board members can be frustrated. At times, executives are frustrated on knowing about actually who's in charge and who's supposed to be taking the lead on some sort of initiative. Obviously, it takes time for those conversations to take place. It's pretty clear that for our staffed organizations, for the person functioning in that executive role, people rely on them. They generally think of them as instrumental in really making a difference. People tend to say if something good is going with this organization, it's because our executive is being able to stitch some of this together. They also, executives tend to feel responsible for all different aspects of their organization. So the challenge becomes, how does an executive support their board to be more than just sort of approving everything that they do, or, showing up to try and support the stuff that they do, which is obviously important. To really transitioning to becoming a strategic partner in this conversation. And it's an ongoing balance of, what can we do? But it does fall onto this idea that the executive has some fundamental responsibility here to take the time to try and support the board's engagement. It's a lot of energy. I realize most executives, we talk to executives all the time. You've got a lot on your plate, and to sort of feel like, how much energy do I have to put toward my board? Research suggests, and our experience suggests, that it's worth your time, but it's tricky to balance what you need to do in regards to finances, fundraising, human resources, operations, day-to-day activities and program delivery, and try to figure out how to fully integrate your board members so that they feel like that they're active participants. Angela referenced some of those challenges at the beginning. I mean, some board members are, really just tangentially connected to our organizations, but the richness and the sustainability of our organizations comes through that deeper engagement with a broader set of individuals. So here's a few suggestions that sort of come up about facilitating peer-to-peer interactions, obviously showing deep respect and consideration for our board members, making good utilization of time. We could talk a little bit about structures, how committees are structured, the way that the board meetings themselves are structured and functioning, encouraging and promoting the good work of the board. imagining what else can be done. We've already had some of those conversations. And this key piece about information. What's the right kind of information? We'll talk about that in just a second. The other thing I want to just touch on is boards have a lot of responsibilities. Boards see themselves as having fiscal responsibility, accountability, legal accountability. But the research is pretty clear that the board's ability to sort of help facilitate some of these high-level strategic decisions in facilitating of the plan, but also I always talk about positioning the organization, our role. There was a reference to how the organization fits in conjunction with other actors within the community. And that becomes a really key thing, and the board can be a critical facilitator and understanding what I call the position of the organization in regards to others. And so some of those high level strategic decisions are critically important. And we see it again here when we ask executives what's important. And this was actually listed in orders of what they're looking for their board to do. So again, this was a recognition. There's a lot the boards are asked to do, but strategy is a critically important function. So I just want to talk just a little bit about what I mean by strategy, or what we mean by strategy. Angela touched on this as well in regards to sort of where is this level of decision making? Where is the board supposed to be connected? How is the board supposed to be connected, and in what way? So I use two different slides to sort of help me think through some of this stuff. One here in regards to sort of a classic organizational structure that we might consider, where you think about let's see if I can get this to work, right? So corporate level, high level decision making. This is really where we imagine the board to be sitting, facilitating and supporting our work in regards to setting the mission, as you saw in some of those, but also thinking about the position of the organization and the dimensions upon which we sort of do our work. Where do we function? What's our, I even use the term industry. What's the market, or what's the frame that we see ourselves in, and how do we think about that? And if the board can be a part of those conversations, it can be quite useful. We also know that the board sometimes will get a little bit into some of these conversations about resource allocations and the budgeting practices and some of that kind of stuff. But we really don't want the board necessarily down in some of these service delivery, program fulfillment, and some of these kinds of activities down in this level. So this is one way of thinking about this. And folks can, I'll ask folks to interrupt me if they've got particular questions. The other way that I think about this, and I actually like this one even better, but it's fairly similar in its way of thinking in some ways, right? Because you've got programmatic elements down here, program components, but this is really just a planning guide. This was pulled together by a buddy of mine, Dave Rentz in Kansas City at the Midwest Center. I really appreciate Dave's work and have been a fan, but also studied a lot with Dave. And this is actually a very useful tool. And what we're saying is that the board's conversation is up here in this strategy formation phase. It's helping us set in place the mission and purpose of our organization. It's helping us understand the external environment. But this is key too, right? And this is an example of that partnership. They need to understand what's going on in the organization sufficiently to be able to articulate, well, where are our strengths? And this is where an executive can be critical in helping people understand, well, here's where we see ourselves as being particularly good, particularly weak, opportunities and things like this that we can sort of begin to think about that might inform our decision making. But these are all areas that I would expect a board to be able to be engaged in, setting. Many of you probably have conversations about the vision or mission, values, critically important conversations that boards probably need to revisit. Some of our most successful conversations sometimes is just talking with board members and executives. What are the values of your organization? Some of you may say, oh, that's set, that's all good, some of these conversations. Okay, so then let's work down to the next level. What are your long-term goals? And long-term for me in this kind of environment can be over the next 6 months, can be the next year, can be the next 3 years. We might even set a vision that says, what are we going to look like in 5 years? right? So this can be some of that longer term. What are our priorities? What are our objectives? What do we want to be able to see? So this can include service objectives. This can include sustainability objectives. This can include operational objectives. There can be a variety of things. And that's what this starts to get at. Strategies here really are those topics that Angela was talking about, right? What are we going to do with our people? How are we going to put together our portfolio of programs? What are the information and technology needs that we're going to have in our organization? What's our marketing and public relations kinds of activities that we may be able to engage in? This is not details of program specifics down here. It's really setting in place particular priorities, and that's linked to budgeting. And so I find this slide, if you take a few minutes to kind of work it through, it can be quite useful for folks to be able to recognize this distinction between what are we asking the board to do and what are the things that the staff is implementing. But we have to be able to bring the board along sufficiently so that they can actually be engaged in these conversations in a coherent and useful way. And that's a little bit of what a couple of the next slides are going to be, is where I kind of give a couple of thoughts, a couple of ideas about how this can take place. And again, feel free to sort of interject here with questions. And I know I got folks monitoring the chat board too. But I like this as a useful kind of tool. So the planning process, right, is this opportunity for us to try and be able to engage individuals in decision-making for our organization. And I really do think about it in a relatively simple manner, in this idea that there are sort of three components to it. This idea of making sure that we've got the right kind of information, and we'll talk about this in the next piece. We know what we're trying to be able to do. What are our objectives here in regards to this planning process? We're revisiting our mission. We're revisiting our value statements. No, we're coming up with goals and strategies and priorities. No, we're going to try and increase understanding amongst board members. This is also another really key area. People don't always fully understand, the board members in particular don't always fully understand why we do what we do and the intended impact that we believe that we have as part of our organization. So even just people understanding why the functions and work that we do is important. And then there's these kind of processes of conversation, if you will. This is the discussion session. This is where we have some conversations. So we set up, we provide some information to our board, we pose a few framing questions, and then we launch into some conversation and discussion, and from frameworks to try and be able to analyze stuff with our eyes toward what it is that we're trying to be able to achieve. And I know that's overly simplified planning process, but we can pull out the book that's got the 14 steps to planning. But in the other reality is that's probably overdone for a lot of us. And we really just need to recognize that this is an ongoing process, and we'll have ongoing conversations. I don't believe for a minute that strategy is a one-time thing, or that we do it at our retreat. These are conversations that should be happening throughout the year. And so you can't get to everything all at once. You can't cover all of the topics on resource development and HR and culture and board development. You cover those over time and prioritize different topics, and then have different strategies as you work your way through the year to sort of work through some of these topics. Let me just touch on a couple of a bit more unpacking of a couple of these ideas. And be able to sort of give you a few thoughts. We didn't, Angela and I talked about the SWOT analysis would be one that you could also put in here, but we figured a lot of you probably knew that and were familiar with some of those ideas. It's a common one that we might use our board to have a conversation about strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, but that would be another practice as well. But I wanted to talk about some of these others and use that as a way to sort of orient our thinking about how to be able to, and again, these have to do with these processes here, right? What do we do with the board to try and be able to facilitate their capacity to make decisions and position us appropriately we need to be able to facilitate some good conversations. So a couple of ideas, couple of thoughts, and 2 tactics. The agenda setting, many of you know this and have experienced it, but I think sometimes we forget how important it is to clarify what the question is and what our purpose is. Now, these are conversations about our values, and this is what values means to us. These are conversations about setting the strategic priorities for the next year. These are conversations about our human resources, about particular elements. So reminding ourselves what it is that our focus is and what's a priority for us can be quite useful in helping the board orient themselves and know what it is that they're trying to be able to be thinking about and focusing on. And so I touch on some of these, even this idea of, we're not trying to make a decision here. We just want to be able to unpack some ideas. We just want to have a conversation, right? So this outcome about having better understanding about what we do may mean that there's no decision that needs to be made. It may mean that we just need to have a conversation so that everybody's on the same page and understands why we have this portfolio of programs that we do and what it's intending to be able to do in regards to its objectives. So this clarifying what it is that we're trying to do is critically important. And then the second piece that I see is challenging for folks has to do with both for board members, how do I manage the information that's coming at me? A lot of new information, a lot of information I may not fully understand. And for executives, it's challenging to be able to figure out what information should I be providing to you? What kind of information is the most useful? What's the right way to be able to provide that information? And that really is a negotiated process by which executives provide some information, get a sense about whether it's useful, about program strategies, the extent to which programs are being successful, information about participants. You revisit conversations. It's a recognition that you can't just dump everything on people. So we see all different kinds of levels of things that happen in regards to the kinds of information that's provided to folks. Sometimes somebody will show up and they'll give them so much information they can't possibly process it. Reams of reports and elements, but no distillation about what it means or what would be a priority. So it's related to this idea of the agenda setting where you're trying to give people just enough information, appropriate amount of information, and distilled in a way that is useful or informative for the kinds of conversations that you want to have. And I recognize how tricky that is and easy to be able to say, but a careful process of thinking about how are we going to provide the information and what kind of information, and we need to make sure that people are on board. The other piece here is some of this has to do with making sure we have a conversation with individual board members. Do you understand where we're going and why we're having this conversation? It's surprising to me how often we don't sort of have that secondary just check base to make sure that people are on board with us in regards to what we're thinking about. So those are a couple ideas in regards to information. Let me just talk about 2 tactics here that we tend to bring up as particularly useful or can be important. And I find that board members can engage in these both relatively easily. One is the stakeholder analysis. Many of you have probably done this, familiar with it, and find it useful or maybe not so, but elements of it that can be informative in what it is. So let me just quickly sort of specify what this is about, right? So it's fundamentally our ability to be able to identify stakeholders in our context and think about who are the people that are important for our organization, or in this instance, really groups or clusters of individuals. The other diagram that I tend to use here is that process of Post-it notes, right? Where you literally just ask people, who are the stakeholders of our organization? So at a facilitated board meeting or at a board meeting, you just simply ask the board. I've given you some Post-it notes, write down one stakeholder per Post-it note, and let's put them up on the board and take a look at them. And what you can see is that relatively quickly, you can start to map out different words that relate to our employees, different words that relate to executives, maybe our board members themselves. So this is a corporate slide here. But people who donate to us, aspects of the government, people who are work on finances. So these external ones probably are less relevant specifically to you. But this process of just mapping or looking at or clustering what you perceive to be the stakeholders and then talking about well, who are they? What are their interests? What are their concerns? They want what from us? What are they concerned about? Okay, so we're talking about the local city government. What are their interests in regards to who we are and what we do? We're talking about a group of funders, retirees, let's say, that live in a particular community, or individuals who've gone to a particular church or faith denomination. What are those individuals' interests in us? And then the second thing I ask people to think about is, how much influence do those stakeholder groups have over the operations of your organization? In other words, can they do things to impact your organization? We're going to see in the next slide is an attempt to try and map some of that stuff. A higher level consideration is the way that some of these components might link together, about the way that they can relate to each other. And then ultimately we think about, well, what is it that we do? Let me show you one more map, one more thing. So as you start to cluster out those different stakeholder groups, then you start to say, oh, wow, donor, the county or the state has a fair amount of power over us because they fund 30% of our work, right? And then how much interest do they have in you in regards to their priorities? How much are you a significant concern for the county, right? And it could be, in some instances, some donors might find themselves ending up in this little square here. While they have pretty significant power over you, they may have low to modest interest in your organization or full understanding about who you are, or they have priorities that extend far beyond who you are. These are judgments that ultimately you have to make about different stakeholder groups. How interested are they in our organization, and how much influence do they have over our organization? A lot of it has to do with money and their capacity to be able to control your behaviors. But you could begin to play around with both the groups that reflect a coherent cluster of individuals, youth from a particular region, again, a particular denomination or a particular donor group. So we try to find the right way to define a stakeholder constituency group, and then play around with some of these. These are actually great conversations, quite useful, quite insightful for folks. I hadn't thought about that constituency group at all as being different from this other one. You're right, they are a little bit different. They do have different interests in who we are, and it does have some implications about what we might need to do. And why I like this too is because I try to focus conversations on the external environment. I try to focus the conversations, while I'm concerned about employees and it is a key component. In this analysis, the more that I can get people thinking about external constituencies, consumers, beneficiaries, donors, influential constituencies, legitimacy providers, the more that we can recognize some of those players and the way that they think about us and what their interests are, it gets us oriented toward the external environment, which can also be quite useful. Because then you can begin to say, well, what are we doing? What's our response to those individuals? What are our response to those different constituency groups? So as a very useful conversation for board members is utilizing this stakeholder conversation and clarifying and thinking a little bit about. And then it goes so far as to be able to say, oh, wow, people in this constituency group, we've got to take care of them. We got to make sure that they're satisfied and that they're attended to. People in this constituency group, we need to address their concerns, but we may need to be able to be careful about all the kinds of commitments that we're making to them. Context setters, maybe you're actually trying to increase people's understanding of who you are. So you're trying to get the county to understand you better in your role and why you should be a priority for them. So this actually gives specific advice in regards to as groups end up in different quadrants, this gives specific advice or thoughts in regards to what might you do for those individuals. So that's a useful conversation, useful tool, a useful way to engage your board in a strategic conversation. And some of you are probably familiar with that tool, and it is fairly approachable for many board members because it doesn't take a huge level of background necessarily, as long as they got some sense about who you are, and it can be quite informative as they listen to those conversations. Another one I invite you to consider, and again, maybe you've done some of this, is an attempt to try and take all of your program activities and organizational activities. This includes fundraising, this includes your services and your program activities, and sort of mapping them out. And I don't use again, pardon the academic mapping here of different elements, but I use this one right here. It's quite useful. And basically what you do, I'm going to go one more slide forward, then I'm going to jump back. So pardon me. You identify all the different things that your organization does. We provide counseling services. We provide after school programs. We engage in an event, a program activity. We have an annual giving campaign. And again, these are services or activities that are engaging some of those external stakeholders. So you start to list all of these things. And again, you have some conversation about why are you clustering things that way? Is this program the same as that program? So even just the process of definition and coming up with those activities is quite useful. Then you make a judgment. You know, that after school program is huge, has a huge impact on the things that are really important to us and what we're trying to do for our organization. You know, I can never, you know, I've had these conversations and somebody's like, oh, you know, that, I think it was a pumpkin selling, right, where they sell pumpkins for Halloween. They're like, that doesn't do much for our mission, doesn't do much to move forward people's awareness about who we are, and doesn't even raise very much money, which is the other one. Does this program pay for itself? So the after school program, we get good amount of money from the city to help make that happen. But the counseling program, while we think it has a high impact, we're not getting as much support for that, or some other kinds of program or activity. And what you can do is you can actually map it. You can actually see, there's the after school tutoring program. We think it has, we can fund it. We're getting money to be able to pay for it. And we think it has a nice high impact. It's very positive. And then the size of these things reflects the budget size or impact, or maybe in this instance, the number of kids. So somebody talked about summer programming, right? We actually do, I guess in this instance, these are losing a little bit of money. Right. And it like many of our services, we can't necessarily, so pardon me, this is negative money. This is positive money. So you'll notice the festival over here, while it may not have a huge impact, right, it does necessarily raise quite a bit of money, brings in quite a bit of profitability. So by looking at a couple of dimensions, so this activity, this portfolio mapping achieves multiple objectives. One, it brings people up to speed on the activities of the organization and the defining units. What are these and how might we define them, right? And it puts a bit of quantification on them by making judgments. And I don't expect high levels of sophistication here. You basically make some judgments. I'd give it a, you know, out of a 1 to 5 on impact, I'd give it a 5. I'd give it a 1. I'd give it a 0. It has relatively limited impact on our mission, right? But financials, you can actually look at some numbers and try to make some judgments about what's profitable and what costs you money. But by seeing it this way, you can facilitate a conversation with your board to be able to say, is this something we need to do something about? Do we need to fix this? Do we need to adjust this? Is there some way that we can shift this to have more of an impact? Is there a way that we can make it to be more profitable? You know, same thing here, right? If you say, if this is really important, can we somehow shift it this way a little bit? And again, as you start to set up strategic priorities, you could begin having these conversations about how might we shift something this way. So I did it quick. I did want to give you reference to this. So the nonprofitsustainability.org is Gene Bell's and Steve Zimmerman's website that maps this out and actually goes through those steps very easily. It's surprisingly easy. I didn't give enough time here today to be able to go over it, but it's surprisingly easy to be able to have these conversations and surprisingly insightful for folks. on all three of those levels. What are we doing? And what value do they produce are great conversations that board members benefit significantly from. I'm careful here to be sensitive to folks' time. I appreciate Nicole for posting some of those out, as well as subsequent events. Sort of important to point out that I think next week we've got a short couple-hour webinar. If you're curious about learning a little bit more about board roles and functions, Kenny and I do that one. It's a great smaller group. We try to keep it no more than about 25 folks, so we can have a bit more of a conversation than a webinar like this. And then, of course, Angela's teaching this course coming up on March 3rd. If you really want to get into it and spend 3 weeks thinking about nonprofit governance and thinking about the executive's role, I think, in particular. But Angela, anything else there that I should chime in on that? Oh, you're on mute.
No, I don't think so. I think you've covered everything with the classes.
Sorry, I went fast, but I appreciate being able to kind of go through some of those ideas. Happy to follow up with folks if they've got questions afterwards. And I know we're going to stay on for a few minutes too, Angela, for a few folks who are hoping to stay and chat with us. So we're happy to be able to do that. I'm sure it was covered. All this information is going to be posted on the website, and you saw that prior webinars are there as well. Boom, boom, boom. I went a little fast, but
it was terrific. And it was so nice to know this. And guys, those of you that are still with us, Will's so humble and it's always great to work with, but I mean, he's considered one of the leading nonprofit governance scholars in the country. And he just sits down and talks with us and makes it very understandable. So we're really lucky to have him here in Texas. And I would say that even if I didn't work with you, Will, even if I was just at Arnova. And I think that Dr. Taylor has actually joined. I was like looking through the people who are here, but now Dr. Kenny Taylor is actually leading the nonprofit governance section of our nonprofit scholars academy. It's kind of the nerd crew. It's where we get together every year and really try and get, work out some of these theories. But so Will has held that position in the past. Kenny has it now. So, we care deeply about governance. So just let us know how we can help you. Because we know that one thing we know is good boards aren't accidental. So it's a lot of hard work, and we're here to help you if we can. Maybe Kenny will say hi. Give us a wave.
Hi.
There he is. He was trying to hide. That's not allowed.
Good to see everybody.
One knee to the other.
Yeah, good to see all of you guys. Thanks so much for your support as usual. And I know that today's session went great, having Dr. Seaworth and Dr. Brown. So good to see you guys.